When the judge's gavel struck, it sounded less like justice and more like thunder, splitting his world apart. Jackson Ward stood in that cold, echoing courtroom with his hat in his hands, watching as his ex-wife, Clarissa, smiled, the kind of smile that only people who believe they've won forever can wear. She took everything, the house in town, the car, the furniture, even the dog, and laughed when the lawyer mentioned what was left for him. "All that's yours now," she said, her voice sugar-coated with pity. "That broken old ranch that even the vultures won't land on." Everyone chuckled, even the judge's lips twitched. Jackson only nodded, eyes steady, and walked out without a word. The world outside was hot and dry, the kind of heat that could melt both metal and pride. His boots echoed down the courthouse steps, each step a reminder of everything he'd lost, or maybe everything he'd finally been freed from. The ranch lay 2 days west, deep in a patchy valley where the land rolled empty and untamed. Folks said it was cursed, burned out years ago in a storm that swallowed half the herd and most of his family's savings. But when Jackson reached it, covered in dust and silence, something strange stirred inside him. Beneath the ash and broken fences, beneath the sagging barn roof and rusted tools, he saw memories: his father mending fences at sunrise, his mother humming old gospel tunes by the window, his younger self dreaming about rebuilding it all someday. Clarissa had laughed when he told her about that dream once. "A dream," she'd said. "You can't fix a graveyard, Jackson." But standing there now, watching the sun dip low behind the mountains, he whispered back to the wind, "Then I'll raise the dead if I have to." The first few nights were brutal. No power, no water, only coyotes for company and a bed of dust and splinters. Yet every morning he rose with the sun, hammer in hand, sweat pouring like the earth itself was testing him. Neighbors passed by on their way to town, shaking their heads. "Poor fool," one said, trying to rebuild the past. But Jackson didn't care. He wasn't building for anyone to see. He was building for something deeper, maybe pride, maybe peace, maybe revenge. By the second week, the barn roof stood again. By the third, the well began to give water after 15 years of silence. And by the fourth, he found the small, metal chest buried beneath the old stable, one his father had sworn to take to the grave. Inside was dust, old deeds, and a sealed envelope addressed to him. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single letter and a key. The letter read, "Son, when they tell you this land is worthless, remember, some riches aren't gold, but some gold hides where only the patient dig." The key had the mark of a mining company long gone bankrupt, or so people thought. Jackson stared westward, where the hills shimmered under the burning sun. He smiled for the first time in months. Clarissa's laughter echoed faintly in his memory, and he whispered, "Let her laugh. I'll give her something to remember." That night, as the wind howled across the valley, Jackson lit a fire in the old fireplace. The house might have been broken, the paint might have peeled, but its foundation, like his spirit, was still strong. The storm had taken everything from him once, but this time he was ready to take something back. The morning after Jackson found the letter, the valley seemed different, quieter, like it was holding its breath. The sun bled over the horizon, cutting through the thin fog that crawled over the fence posts. And for the first time, the land didn't look ruined. It looked waiting. Jackson sat on the porch with his father's letter open again, the paper trembling between his fingers. The name stamped on the key, Cochise Mining Co., kept echoing in his head like an unfinished song. He remembered the stories old miners used to tell at the saloon about veins of gold hidden beneath the Apache cliffs, about tunnels sealed after an explosion in the 1800s that took half a dozen lives and buried the company in debt. Everyone had stopped searching after that. Everyone except, it seemed, his father. Jackson mounted his old horse Bandit and rode west toward the jagged hills that guarded the ranch like sleeping giants. The ride was long and silent, except for the rhythmic clop of hooves and the low whisper of wind through dry grass. When he reached the cliffs, he found what looked like a scar in the earth, a cave entrance half hidden behind fallen rock and cactus. His father's initials, H.W., were faintly carved into the stone. Jackson's chest tightened. He dismounted, took a lantern, and stepped inside. The air smelled of rust, ash, and something ancient. The deeper he went, the more the walls seemed to close around him, until he reached an old door made of iron and wood. He slipped the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. The door creaked open, releasing a stale breath of air, and there it was, a tunnel lined with abandoned mining carts and rusted rails, leading deeper into darkness. Jackson lit his lantern higher, and as he moved forward, the flickering light began to reflect, faintly, then brighter off, veins of gold running through the rock like lightning frozen in stone. His heart pounded. His father had been right all along. This land wasn't cursed, enough to rebuild the ranch, pay off debts, and live a dozen lives in peace. But Jackson didn't smile. Instead, he felt something colder. Clarissa's voice returned in his memory, her laughter in the courtroom, the smug way she'd called him a fool. She had mocked him for holding on to this useless dirt. He clenched his jaw. "Let's see how useless it is now," he muttered. For the next few weeks, he worked in secret, hauling small loads of ore back to the ranch and refining it using his father's old smelting tools. Every night, the gold shimmered faintly in the firelight, and every morning he buried it under the barn floor, keeping it hidden from eyes that didn't deserve to see it. The neighbors whispered about him, said he'd lost his mind talking to ghosts, that he was fixing a place the desert had already claimed. But Jackson didn't care. He wasn't building just a home anymore. He was building a future that would make every sneer in that courtroom turn to silence. By the end of the month, he had already uncovered more gold than his father could have dreamed of, near $10 million worth by market value. Still, he told no one, not yet. The land had given him its secret, and he would guard it like blood. Then, one night, as thunder rolled in from the horizon, a carriage appeared on the distant road, through the rain and lightning. Jackson saw her, Clarissa, stepping down in her fine city clothes, holding an umbrella against the storm. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile even, but her eyes still carried that same cold fire. "Jackson," she called out, her voice barely rising above the wind. "I heard you're still living in this graveyard." Jackson smiled faintly from the porch, gold dust still on his hands. "Funny," he said, "some graves turn out richer than the living." She frowned, confused, but the wind swallowed the rest of his words. Behind him, buried beneath the barn, the gold gleamed, silent, patient, waiting for its turn to change everything. Clarissa hadn't set foot on the ranch. Since the day she told Jackson it was a pile of dust, not worth a dime. But when the train dropped her off at the small desert station and she saw that same stretch of land glimmering beneath the burning sun, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was pride, maybe guilt, maybe the rumor she'd overheard in town that Jackson Ward, the man she'd mocked and left, had somehow turned that ruined ranch into something valuable again. Her curiosity had teeth, and those teeth. The sky was heavy with thunder when she arrived, the smell of rain mixing with the dry scent of sage. The ranch looked different, now stronger, alive. The barn was new, the fences stood straight, and the fields stretched wide with wildflowers and wheat. For a place everyone had written off, it breathed like it had been reborn. Clarissa stepped down from the carriage, her boots sinking into the mud. Jackson stood on the porch, his shirt rolled up, arms still thick from work, face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He didn't move when she called out. "You rebuilt it," she said softly, as if the sight alone took her breath away. "You actually rebuilt it." Jackson leaned against the railing, calm and unreadable. "Didn't think you'd care to see it." Clarissa's eyes flickered with discomfort. "I heard things," she said, forcing a smile. "That you've done well for yourself. That you found something out here." Jackson didn't answer. He just stared at her, the silence stretching like a rope pulled too tight. Clarissa looked around, pretending to admire the work. "You always had a way with dirt and dreams," she said lightly. "But I have to admit, I didn't expect you to make it this far. Maybe I underestimated you." "You did more than that," Jackson said finally, his voice low, like gravel rolling in a dry creek bed. "You buried me." She flinched. "That's not fair." "Fair's what the judge gave you," he said. Here's something else." His eyes caught the lightning flash, and for a second she saw something in them: strength, pain, and something else she couldn't name. "I didn't come here to fight," she said, her tone softening. "I came because—" She hesitated, searching for words that might earn forgiveness. "Because I wanted to see you, to talk." Jackson nodded slowly, stepping down from the porch. The thunder rumbled louder. "Talk then," he said, "but make it quick. Storm's cumin." She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized how much she'd lost. He wasn't broken anymore. He wasn't the desperate man begging her to stay. He was calm, steady, dangerous in a quiet way. "You could come back to town," she said. "Sell this place, start over. You don't belong out here alone." Jackson gave a small, humorless laugh. "Alone? Lady, I got the land, the sky, and ghosts that talk louder than any man in town." "Ghosts don't buy you comfort," she snapped. "Gold does." Jackson's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. "Funny thing about gold," he said, stepping closer. "It don't change the kind of person you are. Just shows it clearer." Clarissa blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jackson smiled faintly. "Means some people'd sell their soul for a tand. Some folks already did." A streak of lightning split the sky, thunder shaking the ground. She stared at him, realization dawning too late. "You found it," she whispered. "You really found it." Jackson said nothing. He turned, heading back toward the barn. "Go home, Clarissa," he said over his shoulder. "Storm's about to wash away everything that don't belong here." And when the rain finally fell, hard and fast, She stood alone on the porch, her umbrella trembling in her hand, watching as the man she left behind disappeared into the golden storm of his redemption. The storm hit like a hammer, the sky cracking open as if heaven itself had lost patience with the earth. Wind tore through the valley, bending the wheat flat and slamming shutters against the ranch walls. Jackson stood inside the barn, lantern swaying from the beam above, the gold hidden beneath the dirt floor glinting faintly each time lightning flashed through the cracks. He could feel the storm in his bones. But it wasn't the weather that made his heart race, it was the sound of footsteps behind him. "You think I'd leave that easy?" Clarissa's voice cut through the thunder, sharp and cold. She stood in the doorway, rain running down her face, her fancy city dress clinging to her like wet silk. "I know what's here," she said, stepping closer. "The gold, the mind, don't pretend I don't. You think you can keep that to yourself after what you owe me?" Jackson didn't turn. He just kept his eyes on the lantern. "Owe you," he said softly. "For what? For laughing when the world buried me. For walking away when I needed you." She clenched her fists. "I built a life with you. I helped you once this land, your name, everything you have started with me, and ended with you," Jackson said, his voice low, steady. He turned then, and the look in his eyes stopped her cold. It wasn't hate burns too quick. It was something heavier, quieter, like stone that had learned patience. "You want what's under this barn," he said. "Then go ahead, dig." He tossed her a shovel, the metal clattering against the floor. She hesitated. "You're bluffing. Try me." The rain hammered harder, and lightning split the sky open. Clarissa stepped forward, anger replacing fear. "You think I'm scared of a little dirt," she hissed. She drove the shovel into the floorboards, splinters flying. The first strike echoed like a gunshot. Then another. Then another. Jackson said nothing, just watched, his shadow long and silent against the barn wall. Finally, the shovel struck something solid. Clarissa froze. She knelt and brushed away the soil with trembling hands. Gold bars gleamed up at her, glowing in the lantern light like the sun trapped underground. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You really did it." Jackson crossed his arms. "Looks different than you imagined, doesn't it?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide, greedy, desperate. "We could start over," she said quickly. "You and me. Forget everything. We can leave this place, sell it, build something new." "You mean by something new?" he said flatly. "You never built a thing in your life. Don't do this," she pleaded. "We were good once, Jackson." "No," he said quietly. "I was good. You were just there." The wind screamed through the broken planks, scattering dust and gold dust alike. Clarissa stood, her hair whipping across her face, her voice trembling now. "You can't keep it. The law will take it, or someone else will. I'll tell them it's my right." Jackson smiled faintly. "You tell whoever you want. By the time they get here, the land will have taken it back." She blinked in confusion, then her eyes widened as the floor beneath them groaned. The storm had soaked the earth deep, and the old mining shaft below the barn began to give way. Cracks snaked across the floor. Jackson lunged forward, grabbing her hand just as the ground split open. For a heartbeat, they hung between past and abyss. "Let go," she screamed. "You'll fall too." Jackson looked at her, the woman who'd once shared his name, his dreams, and his ruin, and, for the first time in years, he felt nothing but peace. "Maybe that's what the land wants," he said softly. The floor gave way. The gold, the dirt, the secret soul of it vanished into the darkness below, swallowed whole by the earth that had hidden it for generations. When the storm passed, the barn stood silent again, half collapsed, its treasures buried once more. But outside, under the breaking dawn, Jackson stood in the rain, covered in mud and breathing hard. The land had taken back its detanned, spared its sun. The world woke gray and wet, the desert washed clean of its dust for the first time in years. Steam rose from the soaked ground like breath from sleeping beasts, and the only sound was the soft drip of water from the barn's broken rafters. Jackson sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, boots caked with mud, his body aching from the night's struggle. The storm had taken almost everything: the roof of the barn, half the fences, and every trace of the gold that had once glimmered beneath the floor. But as the dawn bled through the clouds, the ruin looked different. It looked honest, like the truth finally standing without disguise. Clarissa was gone. The last he remembered was the scream, the crash, the earth swallowing what greed had dug up. He'd searched until the wind died and the rain turned to mist, calling her name into the dark, but the mine had sealed itself again, a mouth closing over secrets it had decided to keep. Now the silence pressed around him, heavy yet merciful. For the first time in months, maybe years, there was nothing left to chase or hide. He poured coffee from the blackened pot, its tastes like burnt dust and memory, and stared out toward the horizon where the sun was breaking through. The valley glittered faintly with puddles, and for a fleeting moment it looked like fields of silver instead of mud. Bandit grazed near the fenceline.com again, as if last night's chaos had never happened. Jackson exhaled slowly. The gold was gone, but it hadn't vanished. It had gone home. The land had taken what was owed, and in return it had left him alive. That felt like a fair trade. He thought of Clarissa then, not with anger, but with a quiet sadness. She had come back chasing something shiny, but maybe, deep down, she'd been chasing the same thing he once did, proof that all their pain had been worth it. The storm had answered that for both of them. He stood and walked toward the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of wet wood and smoke. Sunlight pierced through the holes in the roof, forming golden shafts that fell exactly where the gold once lay, as if the earth itself was mocking the idea of ownership. Jackson knelt, pressed his palm to the soaked ground, and whispered, "Keep it safe." He knew he wouldn't dig again. Some treasures weren't meant to be lifted twice. When he stepped back outside, the clouds had begun to part completely, revealing a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The ranch stretched out around him, scarred, but still standing. He realized then that he didn't need the fortune or the forgiveness. He needed this moment of stillness, this proof that a man could lose everything and still belong somewhere. By noon, he saddled Bandit and rode out to the ridge above the valley. From there, he could see the whole spread: the broken barn, the shining puddles, the faint trails of smoke rising where lightning had struck the hills. It was beautiful in its ruin. He removed his hat, letting the wind move through his hair, and smiled for the first time since the gavel had fallen in that courthouse. The storm had given him back his land, not to own, but to live with. As the wind swept across the plain, carrying the scent of wet sage and sunlight, Jackson whispered, "Thank you." The desert didn't answer, but somewhere in its silence, he felt the hum of something ancient and kind, like the heartbeat of a place that finally remembered his name. Weeks passed after the storm, and the desert seemed to breathe easier, as if it had exhaled all the chaos, gold, and greed that had troubled it for so long. Jackson woke each morning to the sound of birds calling from the distant cliffs, the wind shifting gently across the valley, and the soft rustle of bandit grazing nearby. The barn had been repaired as best he could, simple but strong, a testament not to wealth but to patience and persistence. Clarissa never returned, and he didn't expect her to. In some strange way, the absence was a relief, allowing him to understand that the story wasn't about proving anything to her or anyone else, but about living fully in the land that had chosen him. He spent his days tending the ranch, mending fences, planting wildflowers and wheat, listening to the creek as it gurgled over rocks polished smooth by years of drought and storm. Each night he sat by the fire with his father's old journal, reading, learning, remembering. The words felt like bridges, connecting him to a man he had never truly understood while alive, yet whose wisdom now guided him like sunlight through the clouds. Some nights, when the wind hummed just right, Jackson swore he could hear a soft voice carrying over the hills the whisper of the land, the echo of ancestors who had once walked the valley, their footsteps folded into the soil. He would close his eyes and feel it in his chest, a quiet reminder that he was exactly where he belonged. Travelers who passed by commented on the ranch's strange serenity, how the land seemed alive and welcoming, unlike any place they'd ever seen. Jackson would only nod, smiling faintly, knowing that the secret wasn't in gold or possessions, but in respect, patience, and the ability to endure. And sometimes, when the sun dipped low behind the jagged cliffs, casting long golden shadows across the valley, he would ride out toward the ridge, letting the wind whip his hat and hair, letting the desert remind him of everything it had given him, man taken. Life became a rhythm, tending, observing, listening, and feeling the pulse of the land, a pulse stronger than any paycheck, more lasting than any fortune. He no longer felt the ache of betrayal or the need to prove himself. The past had its place, but it no longer had power. Jackson had found his peace not in reclaiming what was lost, but in embracing what remained, the earth beneath his boots, the sky above his head, the quiet companionship of his loyal horse, and the deep satisfaction of a life built with his own hands. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, he stopped by the old creek and watched the water ripple over stones. He reached down, letting his fingers brush the surface, and felt a strange warmth, a reminder that the land remembered him, that he had survived, endured, and finally become whole. For the first time in years, Jackson smiled without shadows in his eyes. The man who stayed was not the man who had been broken in courtrooms or storms. He was Jackson Ward, rancher, survivor, and heir to a valley that had given him back more than gold it had given him himself. The horizon glowed gold and violet as night fell. Jackson swung onto Bandit and rode slowly back to the ranch, letting the wind guide him, letting the land whisper its old, eternal song. Somewhere between the hills and the fading light, the past settled into silence, and the future waited patiently for a man who had finally learned to stand, to belong.